King Robert Baratheon's laughter echoed through the great hall of Winterfell like a storm breaking after a long winter. The air smelled of roasted meats, spiced wine, and burning torches. Ned Stark sat beside his oldest friend, wearing a face carved from ice. Duty weighed heavy on his broad shoulders, even while others feasted. Robert slapped him on the back, nearly spilling Ned's wine. "You've grown stiff, Ned. Too much time in the cold north makes a man forget joy." Ned offered a tight smile. "Joy is harder to find when you carry a kingdom on your back." Robert chuckled again, but his eyes softened. "That's why I need you in King's Landing. I need someone I can trust." Those words, innocent to most, felt like a shackle around Ned's neck. He remembered what happened the last time he followed Robert blindly, the rebellion, the blood, and Lyanna's bed soaked in red. Honor had always been his compass. But he wondered now, as Robert asked him to become Hand of the King, if honor alone could guide a man through the thorns of the capital. Catelyn's eyes found his across the hall. She looked calm, but he knew that behind her measured gaze, questions burned. They had spoken about this in private, with quiet voices after the children slept. She did not trust the Lannisters. Neither did he. But still, when the Raven arrived with the message from Jon Arryn's widow, "They killed him," Ned felt the old ghost stir. Jon was like a father to him. If he had been murdered, there had to be a reason. And if the Lannisters were behind it, Robert's life was in danger. Still, even with all this, Ned hesitated. Because to go south meant stepping into a different kind of war. Not with swords, but with lies, whispers, and betrayals. And he had never been a man for such things. On the morning they departed, Winterfell felt colder than usual. The wind carried a warning. Bran had fallen, no, been pushed, from the tower. They didn't say it out loud, but he knew it in his bones. Something dark had come to his house with the royal family. And yet, he left. As their party rode south, Ned kept his silence most days. He watched Arya ride wildly through the trees, while Sansa stayed close to Queen Cersei, eager to impress. The closer they got to King's Landing, the more distant his children felt from him. Then there was the moment with the dire wolf, Lady. Sansa's wolf was executed not for her crime, but Arya's. And Robert had let it happen. That day, Ned saw how little control the king truly had. He saw how much sway the queen held over him. He buried the wolf himself, hands dirty, soul heavy. He wondered, was this the price of refusing to play the game? In King's Landing, Ned found a city dressed in gold but rotting underneath. Whispers filled the Red Keep. Spiders spun webs in council chambers. Littlefinger smiled too much. Varys said too little. And Renly, well, Renly played both sides as if the war had already begun. Jon Arryn's death had not been natural. That much was clear. Ned started pulling at threads, quietly, cautiously. He asked questions. Too many questions. And like a man walking into a snare, he didn't see how fast the walls were closing. Cersei was beautiful, sharp-tongued, and more dangerous than anyone Ned had known. When he confronted her about her children's parentage, about Jaime, about the incest, he gave her a chance. He told her, like a man of honor, to flee with her children. But that was Ned's mistake. Because in the South, mercy was weakness. Honor was foolishness. Truth was a weapon wielded by the reckless. And Ned Stark was still the same man who believed in doing what was right, not what was necessary. He thought Robert would listen. But Robert died on a boar hunt, too conveniently, and Cersei moved faster than any of them. By the time Ned tried to act, it was already too late. The game had been played without him, and he was the last to know. As he stood in the cold dungeons beneath the Red Keep, his hands chained, he finally understood. The South was not a place for men like him. They didn't fear swords, they feared secrets. And he had uncovered too many. But even now, staring at the stone walls, waiting for judgment. Ned did not regret being who he was. He regretted only that his children would pay for his choices. He had refused to play the game. And in this world, that was the same as losing. The cell stank of rot and damp stone. Ned Stark sat with his back against the cold wall, his hands shackled, the iron biting into his wrists. He had fought in battles, ridden through snows that could break a man's bones, and faced rebels with nothing but steel and duty. But none of that prepared him for this: silence, betrayal, and the suffocating weight of failure. He had trusted the wrong people. He had trusted in honor, in truth, in doing the right thing. And in King's Landing, none of that mattered. Varys visited him sometimes. The spider, soft-footed and soft-spoken, came not with keys or weapons, but with words. "You were not wrong, Lord Stark," he had whispered in one of those visits. "Only too slow. Too honest. Too proud." Ned didn't answer. He didn't trust Varys, not truly. But the eunuch brought food and water, and sometimes, news of his daughters. That was all Ned cared about now. Sansa was still in the Red Keep. Betrothed to Joffrey, the boy king. The false heir. The product of incest and lies. And Arya. Arya had vanished. Some said she'd run. Some said she was caught and killed. No one gave Ned a straight answer. He thought of his daughters constantly, each in her own way. Sansa with her dreams of romance and golden courts, utterly blind to the poison around her. Arya with her fire, her wildness, her refusal to fit the mold. He prayed she had escaped. That somewhere out in the filth of the capital, she had found someone kind. Someone who knew the truth. One night, Varys returned with something different in his tone. "They want your confession." Ned looked up. His voice cracked from disuse. "A lie." "Yes," Varys nodded. "A lie. But one that could save your daughter's life. Perhaps both their lives. If you admit to treason. If you bend." Ned laughed bitterly. It wasn't a joyful laugh, it was dry, painful. Bend the knee to a boy who stole a throne he has no right to. Varys didn't blink. "Yes. If it means living. If it means protecting your blood. Think, Lord Stark. The truth has brought you here, to this cell. But a lie might let you walk again. It might spare your daughter a blade." That was the cruel part of the South, Ned realized. Truth had no power here unless it was dressed in gold or carried by someone ruthless. Lies ruled this place. And now they wanted him to join in it. To kneel, to smile, to admit to crimes he never committed. And yet, he thought of Sansa. Of Arya. Of Robb in the north, too young to lead but already preparing for war. Of little Bran, broken from the fall. Of Rickon, who wouldn't understand why his father never came home. If Ned died, they would suffer. He closed his eyes. The next morning, he was dragged from his cell, weak from hunger and darkness, and brought to the steps of the great September of Baelor. The sun hit his eyes like a sword. Before him stood a crowd of thousands, nobles, peasants, merchants, and beggars, all waiting to see if the noble Lord Stark would beg for his life. Joffrey sat on the throne, smug and twisted. Cersei by his side, her face unreadable. Sansa stood nearby, pale and shaking. The High Septon called out the charges. Treason. Conspiracy. Attempting to usurp the throne from King Joffrey Baratheon. Ned looked at the crowd. At his daughter. At the boy king who should never have been crowned. Then he spoke. "I am Eddard Stark of Winterfell," he began. "And I come before you not as a lord or a warrior, but as a father." The crowd hushed. "I was wrong," he said, the words tasting like poison. "Wrong to question the legitimacy of his grace, King Joffrey. Wrong to plot against the throne. I accept the mercy of the crown and confess my crimes." Gasps rippled through the audience. Cersei gave the slightest nod. Varys looked relieved. Even Sansa let out a soft cry of hope. But Joffrey's eyes gleamed. He stood up. "My mother wants him to live," the boy said, voice high and cruel. "My council wants him to live. But they are all wrong." The crowd tensed. "Treason must never go unpunished," Joffrey shouted. "Bring me his head." For a moment, time stopped. Cersei's face turned white. Varys took a step forward but said nothing. Sansa screamed. And Ned just closed his eyes. He had lied to save his daughters. He had betrayed everything he stood for, hoping to protect them. But in the end, the game was never meant for men like him. He had refused to play it. And now, his life would pay the price. The sword fell. The crowd erupted. And in the north, winter crept silently toward them all. The news of Eddard Stark's execution spread through Westeros like wildfire, burning faster than ravens could fly. From the taverns in Dorne to the icy watchtowers of the Wall, men whispered of the northern lord who died on the steps of Baelor's September. Some called it justice. Others, madness. In Winterfell, when Maester Luwin broke the news to Catelyn, her knees gave out before she could cry. Her hand clutched the cold stone wall for balance, but there was nothing to hold on to, not for her, not anymore. Her husband was gone. Her daughters were hostages. And war was now unavoidable. Robb Stark, barely more than a boy, felt his world shift with that message. 1 hour he had been planning how to rescue his father, marching with bannermen, holding councils, trying to think like a lord. The next hour, the game had changed. The father he loved and honored was dead. Beheaded like a criminal. Betrayed not in battle, but by a twisted court where truth meant nothing. That night, Robb stood in the godswood of Riverrun, sword in hand, eyes red but dry. Catelyn approached quietly, her voice raw. "They killed him like a dog," she said. Robb didn't answer. He kept looking at the old heart tree, its face carved centuries ago, now stained with falling snow. "What do we do now?" he finally asked, his voice shaking not with fear, but with rage. Catelyn stepped closer. "We call our banners. All of them. The Lannisters think they've won, but they've only started something they'll never finish." And so they did. House Umber. House Karstark. House Manderley. They all answered the call. The North remembered. The Riverlords joined too. Freys, Brackens, Blackwoods, all brought men, swords, and fury. But it wasn't just about revenge. It was about what Ned Stark's death had revealed, that the South could not be trusted. That honor would get you killed. That the game was rigged, and the only way to survive was to play it better, or burn it to the ground. Back in King's Landing, Sansa's dreams had turned into nightmares. She ate alone, walked the halls with eyes lowered, and learned quickly that any wrong word would lead to pain, hers or someone else's. Joffrey had changed. No, perhaps he had always been this way, and she had only now seen it clearly. He had her father killed, then forced her to look at his head on a spike. He called it a lesson. "Your father was a traitor," he told her one evening, as she stood silently by his side during court. "But you're loyal, aren't you, little dove?" Sansa smiled because she had to. She said what they wanted to hear. She learned that silence was safer than truth. That tears made them laugh. That survival meant pretending. In her own quiet way, Sansa Stark had started to play the game her father never would. Arya, on the other hand, had vanished into the sewers and shadows of the city. Disguised as a boy, traveling with criminals and Night's Watch recruits, she moved like a ghost. No one knew she was a highborn girl, not anymore. Yoren, the old recruiter for the Wall, had hidden her among the filth and the forgotten. Every day she whispered her list: Joffrey, Cersei, Island Pain, the Hound. The names of those who killed her father or allowed it. Unlike her sister, Arya didn't want to survive the game. She wanted to end it. North of the Wall, even Jon Snow heard the news. He had sworn his oath to the Night's Watch, forsaking all ties to family and title. But when Sam gave him the message, Jon felt something inside him crack. His father, his true father, was gone. Killed by the same crown he'd once served. Jon packed a bag that night. Ghost followed him silently through the snow. He would ride south, join Robb, fight the Lannisters. Oaths be damned. But his brothers caught him. They dragged him back, forced him to remember his vows, reminded him of what his father believed in: honor, duty, sacrifice. The very things that got him killed. "You're not your father," Sam had said. "But don't throw your life away just to bleed like he did." So Jon stayed. But the fire had been lit inside him. A fire that would never die. Ned Stark was gone. But in death, he left behind something the Lannisters hadn't expected. Not fear. Not silence. He left behind a legacy. A war. And children who would never forget. The banners of the North had risen. Swords were sharpened, armor strapped, and oaths sworn under the eyes of old gods and new. At the head of it all rode Robb Stark, his father's face carved into his heart like stone. They called him the Young Wolf, but Robb wasn't chasing glory, he was chasing justice. Or maybe vengeance. In the South, they couldn't tell the difference. But in the North, they didn't care. Robb's army moved fast. Too fast for the Lannisters to understand at first. Tywin Lannister had the numbers, the gold, and the ruthlessness. But Robb had something else. Purpose. A reason to fight. A father wrongly executed, sisters taken hostage, and a house whose honor had been spat on in front of the whole realm. Catelyn rode with him, quiet but sharp. Every word she spoke was measured, but every night she wept alone. She had begged Robb not to lose himself in anger. She feared watching one son die trying to avenge another. But Robb didn't listen. Or couldn't. He had been forced to grow too fast, and now he was carrying a kingdom's worth of rage in his chest. When they captured Jaime Lannister, it was a victory the South hadn't expected. The Kingslayer, the lion himself, brought low by the wolf cub. But Robb didn't gloat. He didn't celebrate. He locked Jaime in a cell and refused to let emotion guide him. That was one thing he had learned from his father: never lose control. But unlike Ned Stark, Robb had also learned something else, something darker. If you don't play the game, you lose. And if you play it too honestly, you die. So Robb played, in his own way. He made alliances. He promised Walder Frey his hand in marriage for safe passage across the Twins. He moved his army like a blade through the Riverlands. And for a time, it worked. But war has a way of stealing from you, even when you're winning. Back in King's Landing, Sansa had become a living symbol of northern submission. Every court day she was forced to smile beside the boy who murdered her father. Joffrey's cruelty wasn't just private now, it was performance. He humiliated her in front of the court. He struck her when she spoke too freely. He called her little dove, like she was something fragile meant to be broken. And all the while, she kept pretending. She told them what they wanted to hear. She thanked Joffrey for his mercy. She played the role of the obedient lady. But inside her, something else was growing. A coldness. A silence filled with knives. Every day, she remembered her father's execution. Every night, she swore she would never love again, never trust again, and never forget. Arya, meanwhile, had seen more death than most knights. Traveling under the name Perry, she had become one of the lost, dirty, nameless, forgotten. But she had learned how to fight. How to lie. How to survive. Every time she added a name to her list, she whispered it like a prayer. And in her mind, she kept seeing her father's face, calm, resigned, broken by betrayal. She hadn't just lost a father. She had lost her world. And now she wanted to tear down the ones who built it. Far beyond the wall, Jon Snow faced his own war. He had returned to his brothers at Castle Black, but the world had changed for him. Honor, duty, loyalty, they still meant something. But now he saw what they could cost. When he looked into the fire at night, he saw Ned Stark's head fall again and again. His father had raised him to be better. But better didn't survive. Sam once asked him, "Do you think Lord Stark would have lied, if he knew what would happen?" Jon hadn't answered then. But he thought about it constantly. Maybe Ned Stark died not because he was weak, but because the world was too rotten for men like him. Maybe he didn't refuse to play the game because he was naive, but because he didn't want to become like the rest. That was the irony, Jon realized. His father had died for his honor, but the lie had been the last thing he ever spoke. And still, it hadn't saved him. The truth hadn't saved anyone. As winter deepened and snow began to fall even in the riverlands, rumors of dragons across the sea spread quietly among sailors and merchants. Whispers of a Targaryen girl with fire in her blood and no mercy in her heart. The world was shifting. The board was resetting. And though Ned Stark was long gone, the storm he left behind was only beginning. Snow had started to fall even in the riverlands, soft and thin like ash drifting from a distant fire. It wasn't heavy enough to stop armies, but it was enough to remind everyone what was coming. Winter wasn't just a word Northerners used, it was a promise. A warning. And now, it had begun to whisper across Westeros. Robb Stark sat alone in his tent, eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight. The map in front of him was stained with ink, blood, and regret. He'd won every battle, but the war wasn't a matter of swords and strategy anymore. It was about trust, betrayal, timing, and luck. The kind of things you couldn't control. The kind of things his father never tried to manipulate. And maybe that's why his father died. Robb sometimes caught himself wondering, what would Lord Eddard Stark have done in this moment? What counsel would he give? Would he urge patience? Restraint? Mercy? But Robb had learned something else his father never truly grasped: mercy gets you killed. Promises break you. And the more honor you carry, the heavier your own sword feels. He had broken his vow to Walder Frey. That was no small mistake. He had married for love, not duty, and now the twins were whispering of insult, revenge, and betrayal. Catelyn had warned him. "You are not just a boy in love," she had said. "You are a king. And kings who put their hearts before their crowns end up buried beneath both." Still, Robb hadn't listened. He had tried to hold on to both worlds, love and war, honor and victory. But with each passing day, that balancing act wobbled. Now, he was surrounded by bannermen whose loyalty felt thinner than the ice creeping into the tents. The Lannisters had taken more than a father from him. They had taken the rules and twisted them until even winning felt like losing. And in the south, the game continued. Tyrion Lannister had taken over as Hand of the King in his father's absence, and for a while, chaos began to wear a clever smile. Tyrion wasn't like the others. He didn't crave blood for fun or power for show. He played the game because he had no other choice. In a family of lions, he had survived by being sharper, faster, and more careful than anyone expected. He studied Ned Stark's downfall like a lesson carved in stone. He told the truth, Tyrion once muttered to Bronn. And he died for it. I suppose that's what happens when a man tries to bring honor to a place built on lies. Even so, Tyrion knew the North wouldn't forget. Robb Stark's army wasn't just fighting with steel, they were fighting with memory. Every sword they raised was for the man who refused to kneel. And no matter what the Lannisters did, they couldn't kill that ghost. Sansa remained in the capital, and each day she grew quieter, colder, more controlled. The pain no longer showed on her face. She had learned the same lesson her sister had learned miles away: never let them see you bleed. Joffrey still mocked her, still threatened her, but her tears had dried into something harder. Revenge wasn't something she hoped for anymore, it was something she counted on. Arya, meanwhile, had slipped deeper into the dark. Disguised, dirt-covered, forgotten, she traveled through burned villages and ruined towns. She saw what war looked like from the ground. Not banners and speeches, but hunger, corpses, and screams. She no longer looked like a Stark. She looked like a ghost with a list carved into her memory. She kept adding names. Joffrey. Cersei. Island Pain. The Mountain. The Red Woman. The Tickler. Oliver. The Hound. Names of people who had wronged her, or wronged her family. Names she whispered before sleep, like a lullaby made of knives. But beyond all these scattered Starks and spinning wheels, something larger was beginning to rise. Beyond the narrow sea, a girl with silver hair and dragons in her bones was gaining power. Daenerys Stormborn, last daughter of a fallen house, now carried the flame of old vengeance in her heart. And though she had never met Ned Stark, his death had pushed the world closer to the chaos that would make her rise possible. Because when one man refuses to play the game, others rise to rewrite the rules. Back at the Wall, Jon Snow had finally accepted something: he could not live by his father's values alone. The Night's Watch was not a place for ideals, it was a place for survivors. Wildlings gathered beyond the Wall in numbers not seen for centuries. Something ancient was stirring. And Jon, even as he wore black, felt the ghost of his father behind every step he took. But he knew now that honor wasn't enough. It never had been. Ned Stark had been the last man to believe that truth alone could win a war. The realm was proving him wrong every single day. Walder Frey's hall smelled of old meat, damp fur, and something far worse: false hospitality. Robb Stark stood among the banners of his allies, surrounded by music and wine, but the air felt too still. The smiles were too wide. The laughter too forced. His mother, Catelyn, sat beside him at the high table, her eyes scanning every face like a wolf sensing a trap. And still, despite the unease, the drums kept playing. Despite the cold in her bones, the bride smiled. Despite everything, the doors remained closed. Robb had come to make peace. Or at least, to fix the insult. He had broken his oath to Walder Frey, and now he was here to mend it with marriage, a wedding between his uncle Edmure and one of Frey's many daughters. It was supposed to be a gesture of goodwill. A way to keep the fragile alliance alive. But nothing in Walder Frey's keep felt alive. It felt like the last breath before drowning. Catelyn leaned toward Robb and whispered, "Something is wrong." He didn't answer. He knew it too. But what could they do? They were deep inside the twins. Surrounded by Frey soldiers. Trapped by the very peace they had tried to create. Then the music changed. Not a joyful tune, but something slower, darker, too familiar. Catelyn's fingers clenched her goblet. Her eyes caught the movement, one of the musicians pulling something from his sleeve. A glint of steel. And in that moment, everything unraveled. Screams. Arrows. Blood. The Red Wedding had begun. Robb turned, stunned, as his men were cut down around him. The bride's smile vanished, and her eyes filled with tears as the first bolts tore into the hall. Catelyn grabbed a dagger, screaming warnings that came too late. Grey Wind, Robb's dire wolf, howled from the kennels, trapped, fighting against iron bars until silence took him too. Robb was shot first in the leg, then in the chest. He dropped to his knees, staring not at his killers, but at his mother. She grabbed Walder Frey's wife and held a knife to her throat. "Let him go, and I swear I'll let her live." Walder Frey didn't even blink. "I'll find another wife." Then came the final blow. A Lannister bannerman stepped forward, gold glinting on his chainmail. "The Lannisters send their regards," he said, before plunging a sword into Robb's heart. Catelyn didn't scream. She just stood there, eyes empty, blade trembling in her hand. Then she slit the girl's throat, and the hall took her too. News of the slaughter traveled slower than truth, but when it reached the north, it landed like a blade through the spine. The king in the north was dead. His mother, dead. Half their army wiped out. Betrayed not in battle, but at a feast. Under guest right, under sacred oaths. The phrase broke the laws of gods and men, and the Lannisters, of course, had planned it all. They had played the game. And won. In the south, Tywin Lannister sat in his chambers, quill in hand, writing letters that would shape kingdoms. He hadn't lifted a sword in years, but he had killed more Starks than any general ever could. "You cannot win on the battlefield," he had told Tyrion once. "But you can destroy your enemy with pen and coin, and just enough treachery to finish the job." Tyrion hadn't replied. Not because he agreed, but because deep down, he knew that's how the game worked. His father had done what Ned Stark refused to do. He lied, plotted, betrayed, and lived. In King's Landing, Sansa heard the news while married to Tyrion, now her unexpected and unwilling husband. She didn't cry when they told her. She didn't scream. She just stood at the window, staring at nothing, her hands clenched into fists so tight her nails broke skin. That night, she didn't sleep. Robb had been the last hope. The last wolf standing tall in a world of snakes. And now he was gone. Just like her father. Just like everything else. In the shadows of the city, Arya was closer than anyone knew. She had arrived just in time to hear the aftermath. Just in time to smell the smoke of the twins. She didn't see her brother die, but she saw the remains. And something inside her cracked. The girl named Arya Stark died that day. What remained was something colder. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She added more names to her list, then carved them deeper than ever. One by one. Fry. Lannister. Fry again. And more. Ned Stark had refused to play the game. His son had tried to play with honor. And both were crushed by those who played without it. The Game of Thrones didn't reward the noble. It consumed them. And the realm, now soaked in wolf's blood, howled with the ghosts of the north. Snow fell softly over Winterfell, blanketing the ancient stones like a shroud of silence. The castle that once echoed with laughter, sword practice, and the howls of dire wolves now stood as a ghost of what it had been. Burned. Broken. Stolen. The Boltons held it now. Ramsay Snow, no, Ramsay Bolton, ruled as Warden of the North by decree of the Iron Throne. His house's flayed man banner hung where the dire wolf once flew. And the North, scarred and tired from war, bowed not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Roose Bolton had betrayed Robb Stark at the Red Wedding, carving his name into history with blood. And his bastard son. Ramsay was something else entirely. A creature made of cruelty, madness, and games that only ever ended in screams. But Winterfell remembered. And so did the people. They whispered the name, Stark, like a prayer, like a curse they weren't allowed to say out loud. Even the trees and the gods would seem to watch in judgment, as if waiting for the day their true lords would return. And far beyond, scattered like shattered ice, the surviving children of Eddard Stark began to move. In King's Landing, Sansa Stark no longer dreamed of princes or songs. Her marriage to Tyrion had ended quietly, politically. She was now a piece on a board passed from one player to another. Peter Baelish, the man who betrayed her father while pretending to love her mother, had taken her from the capital, spinning tales of protection, of vengeance, of legacy. He called her his key to the north. But Sansa had learned too much to trust sweet words. She let him think she was a pawn. She let him believe he was in control. But inside, something was changing. She was done being helpless. Done playing the role of the victim. She carried her father's memory like a blade at her side, not sharp, but heavy. A reminder. Ned Stark had died because he believed people would play fair. Because he thought honor still mattered. But Sansa knew better now. This world didn't need another honorable man. It needed a quiet storm. Arya, meanwhile, had crossed the sea. She had reached Braavos, whispered the name of the faceless men, and been taken into a world colder than even the north. A world where identity meant nothing, and death was a gift. They told her to forget her name, to become no one. But no matter how many faces she wore, how many lessons she endured, Arya Stark never truly vanished. She trained with knives and poisons. She learned how to lie, how to kill, how to disappear. But each night, when she lay in the dark, she saw her father's face. Calm, steady, betrayed. The moment his head fell still lived inside her. It burned behind her eyelids. It echoed in her bones. She hadn't forgotten her list. She would never forget her name. And then there was Jon Snow. At the Wall, Jon had become Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. A title that once seemed distant now sat heavy on his shoulders. He made choices that angered his brothers, like allying with the wildlings, like showing mercy when they wanted blood. But Jon understood what they didn't. The true enemy wasn't in the south. It wasn't the Lannisters, or the Boltons, or the Freys. It was coming from the cold. From the shadows beyond the wall. And it would not care who wore what crown. Still, leadership came with a price. When the daggers came, 1, 2, 3, 4, he saw betrayal in the eyes of men he once called brothers. They called it justice. They called it honor. But it was just fear. They stabbed him and left him in the snow, bleeding out beneath the sky his father once looked upon. And still, the world turned. The Iron Throne rested in King's Landing, but cracks were forming across the realm. The North was angry. The Riverlands were burned. The Vale stirred in silence. And across the narrow sea, the sound of dragon wings grew louder. Ned Stark had been gone for years now, but his ghost haunted them all. Every war, every rebellion, every broken vow traced back to that one moment, his execution. The day honor died in the eyes of the realm. But something had survived. Not his body. Not even his name in songs. But in his children, scattered, bloodied, hunted, something had endured. A fire. Not loud. Not quick. But patient. Waiting. Winter wasn't coming anymore. It had arrived. And it would carry the name Stark like a sword carved from ice and vengeance. The North rose not with trumpets or banners, but with silence and cold steel. Winterfell was reclaimed in the dead of night. The snow-covered courtyard that had once seen the blood of wolves now saw the blood of flayed men. Ramsay Bolton, who had laughed at fear and fed women to hounds, was finally outmatched, not by numbers, but by resolve. Sansa Stark stood at the battlements that morning, cloaked in furs, her eyes unflinching as she watched the aftermath. She had brought Jon back to Winterfell. She had convinced the northern houses to remember who they were. And she had faced Ramsay's madness with something stronger than fear, memory. "You can't kill me," he had said, tied and bloodied in the kennel. Sansa had looked him in the eye. "Your words will disappear. Your house will disappear. And you will disappear." Then she left the dogs to finish what the North had started. The game Ramsay tried to play had ended, not with victory, but with silence. And for the first time in years, the Stark banner flew over Winterfell once more. But Winterfell was not the same. The North had paid too high a price to return home. Jon Snow, risen from death by fire and faith, stood beside Sansa as the houses of the North declared him king in the North. The title echoed through the hall like thunder, proud, desperate, defiant. The White Wolf had returned. The North had chosen. But even Jon, in that moment, felt the ghost of his father pressing on his shoulders. He had been raised by Ned Stark. Taught by him. Shaped by him. But now Jon stood in a place his father never could reach. Past death. Past rules. In a world more cruel than even Ned could imagine. Sansa stood by his side, but her eyes were sharper than before. She trusted Jon, yes, but she had learned never to trust the people cheering today. Lords had cheered for Ned once too. And then watched him die. Even now, the game went on. In the south, Cersei Lannister had crowned herself queen, burning her enemies alive and laughing in the ashes. She had killed the last of her children. Burned the September of Baelor. Destroyed faith, loyalty, and legacy in one savage act. She didn't pretend to play the game anymore, she ruled it. And across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen had set sail with fire and fury at her back. Dragons circled her fleet. Armies lined her ships. She was coming not just to take the throne, but to reshape the world. Her vision of justice burned brighter than any crown. And she would tear through anyone in her way. The game Ned Stark refused to play had grown far beyond courts and whispers. It had become something else entirely. A storm. A reckoning. Arya returned to Westeros like a shadow. She crossed the twins in silence, served Walder Frey his own sons in a pie, then slit his throat with a whisper, "The North remembers." No army, no siege, no declaration, just death, personal and precise. She wore many faces now, but the one she never lost was her own. Arya Stark of Winterfell, daughter of the man who died with his honor intact. She no longer believed in mercy, but she remembered justice in its purest, bloodiest form. And Bran Stark, broken boy turned three-eyed raven, returned not as the child who fell, but as something beyond understanding. He had seen everything, past, present, future. He knew truths that others couldn't bear. The greatest secret of all rested within him, Jon Snow's true name. His true blood. His true place. The son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark. The rightful heir to the Iron Throne. Ned Stark had carried that secret to his grave, not to deceive, but to protect. Because even in death, his choices were shaped by love, not ambition. He had lied once in his life, and it had cost him everything. But that lie had protected Jon. Had kept the flame alive. Had kept the game from devouring one more soul. And now, as war consumed Westeros again, as dragons flew and White Walkers marched, the legacy of the man who refused to play the game had become the beating heart of the new world. Ned Stark had not won. He had not survived. But through his children, his silence, his sacrifice, he had changed the course of history. In a world of liars, traitors, and monsters, he had stood for something. And though the realm tried to forget him, though his name was mocked by kings and cursed by fools, the North remembered. And the world would remember too. Because Ned Stark may have died with his head on a spike. But his truth, his real truth, was still alive. And winter had only just begun.